All right, today's notes are on 4.7, the quadratic formula. So yesterday we talked about solving quadratic equations with square roots and with factoring. All right, we have a third method, and this method could work on any problem, no matter what. All right, but it is the method that will take the most time, so it's not always the best choice. When you cannot solve with square roots or cannot solve with factoring, it is your only choice. So we do still need to learn this method. All right. So just kind of summing up a couple of review items. So standard form for a quadratic would be y equals ax squared plus bx plus c. All right, so yesterday we talked about solving with square roots. You would solve with square roots when you have a and c. Talking about the standard form, right? So if you have an a value, that means you have an x squared. All right, if you have c, you have the number without the x. All right, so only in those cases can we use square roots. And square roots is a pretty nice method because it's pretty quick, right? You get your x squared by itself, you take the square root, it's positive and negative of that answer, you're done. Not a lot of time. All right. We would solve with factoring. If the equation's factorable. If you can't factor it, you can't solve by factoring. It's really as simple as that. When we worked with problems when we were factoring, and I asked you to factor them, they were always factorable because we were only practicing factoring. All right, at some point we got to realize that if I had x squared plus 3x plus 1, I can't factor that because 1 times 1 is the only thing that gives me 1 and it doesn't add to 3. All right, so I can't use factoring for something like that. All right, so then I have to resort to the quadratic formula because I've got an a, a b, and a c here, so I can't use square roots. Okay, so we will solve with the quadratic formula. Technically, any time. However, it is your longest method. It will take the most time. So my suggestion, I don't know what symbol I want to do there. I guess a circle. So I only use it when I have A, B, and C, and it's not easily factorable. Okay, if I can look at it really quick and go, yep, I know how to factor that one, factoring is going to be faster. All right, if it takes me 5 minutes to factor the problem, I'd already be done with the quadratic formula by then. Okay, if there is not an A, a B, and a C, there is always a simpler way to solve than the quadratic formula. Can you still solve it with only an A and a C or only an A and a B? Yes, you can, but there should be a shorter thing that you should be using just to save you time. It doesn't mean that it's wrong if you do not. Okay? So that's a little introduction. So our formula that you will need to know is x equals the opposite of b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac, and that's all being divided by 2a. That is our quadratic formula. Okay, that a, that b, and that c, those letters are coming from the same ones we've used from the very beginning in standard form. Okay, so we should already be aware how to find the A, the B, and the C at this point. And it's just plugging it into that. So kind of a long formula. We're going to practice it a lot today, practice it a lot tomorrow. You can use notes on your quiz, but you will not be able to use notes on your test. So by the time the test comes around next Wednesday and Thursday, you should know this formula. Okay? And if you never do any problems, yep, you will not know that formula. If you do every single problem that I assign and we do for review, you really should know this formula by then. Okay, so no need to be freaking out right now. Okay? All right, so we'll go ahead and look at a few problems. So we're just gonna solve. So my first example, 3x squared plus 5x plus 1 equals 0. Okay, so we're talking about the quadratic formula. So every problem we're going to do, we're going to solve with the quadratic formula. But after today, we kind of start to make choices on, well, would I try to factor this? You know, you might try to factor this and find out you can't factor it, and then you wasted time factoring, and then just do the quadratic formula anyways. Some of you might see the 3 in front and go, I don't even want to try to factor that because those are hard for me. All right, so we have another method for you when you get a problem that's maybe more challenging for you to factor anyways. Okay, it's not factorable, so we're just going to do the quadratic formula. But we do need to make sure that our equation's equal to 0, just like in factoring. If it's not, then I don't have it in standard form properly, so I won't get the right A, B, and C. All right, so just a reminder, my A is in front of the x squared. It's just the number, it's not the variable. My B would be the number in front of the x. My C would be the 1. These can be out of order. All right, you may not have it in the alphabetical order necessarily always given to you, but this first one is. Okay, so I'm just going to fill it in the formula. And after that, it's just kind of some calculator work. So I'm solving for x. So I do the opposite of b. Would be -5 plus or minus. I'm going to take my b and square it. -4. I'm filling in the a value as 3. C value is 1. And this whole thing is being divided by 2 times the a. Okay. So I want to see this out on a paper test next week that you can show me these steps. All right, I want to see that you know where to plug everything in. And then I'll show you the next part that I would for sure want to see. Sometimes I'll have, you should really figure out what's inside here first and find out what that number is. All right, so sometimes, like for sake of space, all right, okay, 25 is my 5 squared. I'm taking 4 times 3 times 1 would be 12. So 25 minus 12. So sometimes I write it like that instead of going, okay, -5 plus or minus 25 minus 12 over 6 would equal -5 plus or minus the square root of 13 over 6. So if you want to save some time on writing, sometimes I do this. Just kind of keep a note, keep track of it on top, and then I come down to here in my next step, up to you. All right, but on your test, I would like to see what you're plugging in, and then I'd like to see, well, what did you get in that final answer? All right, so this is our final answer. This is our 2 answers, but in your Math Excel, you always put a comma in between your answers. Right, so I've got -5 plus the square root of 13 over 6 is one answer. That plus or minus is representing both. Okay, then -5 minus the square root of 13 over 6. Okay, so it'll be a little bit annoying to type in. All right, but that's what it would look like. We'll look at more as if the square root of 13 is something that we can simplify as a radical. We will. So we'll look at some examples like that, or if it's a perfect square, we'll keep going. If it's not, we will leave it and be done. Okay. We're going to look at 2 more examples because the answers will look a little bit different. So our second example here, so 2x squared minus 5 equals negative 3x. Okay, this would be a case where I have an A, I have a B, and I have a C. It may not be one that's easily factorable for you. It may not even be factorable necessarily. So this would be a case where we should probably just try quadratic formula anyways for some of you. So that means it has to be equal to 0. So I've got 2x squared minus 5 on one side. So if I add 3x to both sides. All right, now I've got it equal to 0. I technically don't have it in that alphabetical order of A, B, and C. So if it helps you to rewrite it in that proper standard form, go for it. If you can still figure out that your A is 2, your B is 3, because that's the number in front of the x, and your C is the number without the variable, without putting it in order, that's fine, that's up to you. But make sure you can come up with A, B, and C properly either way. Okay? And notice I did not use negative 3 for B because it was not equal to 0 yet. So that would have not been my B. Okay? From here, I'm filling it in my little handy formula again. So I'm trying to find out what x would equal when this is 0. My B is 3, so I use the opposite of B again. Plus or minus the square root B squared minus 4 times my A times my C all over 2 times my A. Okay, a little bit of calculator work here. Work underneath the square root first. We're trying to find that number. So my exponents would say I need to square 3 squared and get 9. Now be careful with your signs inside here. You can do a couple different things. You can think of this as, okay, I'm subtracting. I'm taking 4 times 2. That gives me 8. 8 times a negative 5 would be a negative 40. So I'm subtracting a negative, which turns it into plus. Another way you can think of it, I typically ignore that as a subtraction sign, and I take negative 4 times 2 times negative 5 and come up with positive 40, and then know I'm adding 40 to 9. For me, I make less mistakes that way on the sign. Okay? If you have a calculator that you can type everything in, so like typically not your computer calculators or your cell phone calculators, one you can actually type 3 squared minus 4 times in parentheses 2 times in parentheses negative 5, it will give you that answer of 49. All right, so I should take 9 plus 40. So negative 3 plus or minus the square root of 49, and then 2 times 2 would give me my 4. All right, so you will want to double check some things. Hopefully you're familiar with your perfect squares from a little bit of our practice from last Friday. But 49 is a perfect square, so if you get a perfect square, we are not going to leave it there. All right, we're going to take the square root of 49, and I would get 7 over 4. Now, I will not leave it in that form either. We have to separate it with a comma in Math Excel anyways. So I'm going to take negative 3 plus 7, divide that by 4. So negative 3 plus 7 would be 4 over 4, which is 1. Okay? And then I'll take negative 3 minus 7, divide that by 4. So that would give me negative 11 over 4. Whoops, that would be a 10. Try that again. All right, I also won't want to type negative 10 over 4 in Math Excel because it's not a simplified fraction. That would be negative 5 over 2. Okay, so my final answers here, I'm going to write it off to the side, would be 1, comma, negative 5 over 2. So this time, we got nice numbers, right? Negative 5 over 2 is a lot nicer than negative 5 plus the square root of 13 over 6. All right, when this happens, when you get a nice number, it means this was factorable. Okay, so we could have factored this. Right? If my answer was 1, it would have factored into x minus 1. And negative 5 over 2 should have been 2x plus 5. And then we'd get those answers. Okay, so that would have been one that we could have factored. So you may make a choice sometimes where you are choosing to do the quadratic formula and it was factorable. So you need to make sure you know how to get down to this answer if you ever made that choice or you wanted to do the quadratic formula instead of factoring. You have to know how to still get the same answers if I would have factored. Okay, so you have some that will come out nice like that. It's not that you did anything wrong. It's just maybe this method wasn't the best method, but it still might be the best method for you. Some of you don't love factoring. Okay. All right, I want to look at one more where we solve with the quadratic formula because this answer also will be a little bit different. It's number 3. So 2x times x minus 1 equals 3. Okay. Right now I cannot tell what A and B and C are because for one, it's not in standard form. It's got parentheses. All right, so we need to do some distributing. I need to make sure I get this equal to 0. All right, so then I can start my quadratic formula. So 2x times x would be 2x squared minus 2x, and then that would equal 3. So I want to subtract that 3 then to the other side. So 2x squared minus 2x minus 3 equals 0. Okay. We'll go ahead and do the quadratic formula with this one. If it helps you to write down what A, B, and C are before you start, go for it. If it's not helpful, just start your formula. Up to you. All right, this time I have a negative 2 for B. So I'm going to do the opposite of negative 2 and use positive 2, plus or minus. I'm doing negative 2 squared. Make sure you do parentheses around that or just use your brain when you take negative 2 times negative 2 because that's going to come out positive. If you do not use those parentheses, it will not, and you're always going to get the wrong answer inside of that square root. All right, minus 4. My A value is 2. My C value is negative 3. All over 2 times my A. Okay, so that's the work that I want to see on a paper test. After that, if you just show me what you get inside of that square root, that's fine. So like I said, this will come out to be a positive 4. Make sure you either use parentheses or you know that you're taking a negative times a negative. All right, I like to think of this as negative 4 times 2 would give me a negative 8. So negative 8 times a negative 3 makes it a positive 24. So you can either take those negatives and multiply them together, or you're thinking of it as 4 times 2 is positive 8 times negative 3 is a negative 24. So I'm subtracting a negative 24, which turns into plus. So careful with that. I usually see these are the biggest errors. Not using parentheses here, and then not paying attention to your signs. All right. Otherwise, students do really well with the quadratic formula after they just get familiar with using it. Okay, so I will get 2 plus or minus. Inside the square root, I would have 28 over 4. Yes, we'll separate it into those 2 answers, but I'm not going to use 28 under my square root because I can simplify that radical. All right, so if I use that, Math Excel is not going to mark it correct because it hasn't been simplified. Okay, so I'll go ahead and work with that over here. So there was a reason why I had you work on some things on Friday, and the assignment that was due yesterday. 4 is the perfect square that divides 28. So 4 times 7 would give me 28. The reason why we use 4 is because the square root of 4 is 2. I cannot take the square root of 7 without getting something messy. So then I would leave 2 square roots of 7. So instead of my 20 square root of 28, I'm going to write 2 plus or minus 2 square roots of 7 over 4. Okay, so now it's almost all the way simplified. Now, this 4 is dividing both this 2 and this 2. So technically, I can simplify those to 1 over 2. Right, if I divide everything by 2 on top and everything by 2 on the bottom. So this would be 1 plus or minus 1 square root of 7 over 2. I divided the whole thing by 2 on top, both of those, and this by 2. Or if you wanted to think of it as I factored a 2 out, and I factored a 2 out of the bottom, and those 2's divided each other. However, it makes sense to you. So then my final answer, I would put 1 plus the square root of 7 over 2, and 1 minus the square root of 7 over 2. Will be how I will have to write my final answer. Okay, so those are the 3 different ways that you'll see. You might have some that have perfect squares that you have to simplify and keep going. You might have some that, like when I had the square root of 49, that was a perfect square, so I didn't have any radicals in my answer. And then you might have some, this is what you probably hope for, that don't have any perfect squares, and you leave the radical as it was. Okay, so those are your 3 different ways that you will see. One other part I want to talk about here is a term called the discriminant. All right, this is a special part of your quadratic formula. It is just the part under the square root, so that b squared minus 4ac part. All right, and it is going to tell you the number of solutions. All right, so you have some problems in your homework that will ask you to find the discriminant and then ask you how many solutions there are based on that number. So that should make you excited because you don't have to do the whole formula or simplify things down with the radicals. So pay attention to those directions because I will have a lot of students that will just solve every single problem, and then you're just kind of creating a lot more work than necessary for yourself. All right, so here are the 3 options. If your b squared minus 4ac is greater than 0, so if you get a positive number, then there are 2 solutions. If you remember yesterday, we talked about solutions are zeros, or they're the places where you're crossing the x-axis. So this would mean that you have 2 x-intercepts. So for example, your parabola would cross your graph twice. Okay, so that's visually what's going on. If your b squared minus 4ac would equal 0, then there's only 1 solution. All right, so as a visual, you only cross the x-axis once, so your vertex is on the x-axis. Okay, you should have saw yesterday when solving, you had problems that had 2 solutions, like both positive and -3, and then you had problems where you'd only have 1 answer when you factored if it was the same factor. Okay, the last one here, if b squared minus 4ac is less than 0, so you get a negative number, then there is no real solution. Stay tuned to the end of the week of what we're going to do when we get no real solutions. All right, we'll go ahead and head to lunch here. All right, so if you do have no real solution, graphically what that would mean would be that your parabola would not touch the x-axis. So that graph still exists, that equation still exists, but you will not get a numerical answer for crossing the x-axis. Okay. All right, I want to look at 3 examples where we find the discriminant, and that will be it for our lesson today. So you may see the directions tell you to find the discriminant. And determine the number of solutions. All right, so one example of this, so x times x minus 5 equals -4. All right, in order to find the discriminant, we'll need to know a, b, and c. In order to find a, b, and c, I need this in standard form. So I'd get x squared minus 5x, and then go ahead and add 4 to the other side. Now I should know my a, my b, and my c. The discriminant is only the b squared minus 4ac, so I need to calculate that number. So my b is -5. I will square -5. I'll take 4 times my a, which would be 1, and my c would be 4. So I am taking -5 squared would be 25, and minus 4 times 1 times 4 would be 16. So I get 9. Okay, so in Math Excel, when it asks you what is the discriminant, you would type in 9 for the discriminant, and then to determine how many solutions there are, it'll be multiple choice after that. So 9 is greater than 0, right? 9 is a positive number. So that means when it is greater than 0, there are 2 solutions. So there's 2 places where it will cross the x-axis. So then you would select 2 solutions. Okay. If we had another example where I have x squared equals -2x minus 1. Once again, I need this in standard form. It doesn't matter if I move my -2x minus 1 to the left side or I subtract my x squared to the other side. It's up to you. Personally, I like to move the 2x and the 1 to the other side. Some might say that's more work because I'm moving 2 things, but now everything is positive versus moving everything to the right side and having all of them be negative, and I'll probably make more mistakes with 3 negative numbers in my A, B, and C. So that's my own personal preference. So you can decide what you would want to do in that situation. So for my discriminant, I will take my B is 2, my A is 1 again, my C is 1. 2 squared is 4, 4 times 1 is 4, 4 minus 4 is 0. Okay, so we said above, if my b squared minus 4ac equals 0, then there would only be 1 solution. Okay, so I would type that in, 0 for my discriminant, and then I would select that there is 1 solution. Okay, our last example here for finding the discriminant. So 2x squared plus 2x would equal -1. I'll go ahead and get this equal to 0, so I have the proper a, b, and c. So 2x squared plus 2x plus 1 equals 0. So I'm doing the b squared minus 4ac part again. So 2 is my b, 2 is my a, and my c would be 1. So 4 minus 8. My discriminant is -4. All right, so if that is less than 0, there are no real solutions. it should kind of make sense as to why you'd have 2, 1, or no real solutions in a situation. If you think back to the formula, the b squared minus 4ac is the part that's under the square root. All right, so if I get a negative number under the square root, I can't take the square root of -4, so that doesn't exist. That's why I have no real solution. All right, if it ends up being 0, the square root of 0 is just 0, so then I am just left with whatever negative b over 2a is, which should be a little bit familiar, right? The x-coordinate of your vertex. Okay, it's not a coincidence. All right, if I had something that was greater than 0, so I got, what was it, 9 for the first example? All right, that's going to end up in my square root, which I'd be able to take the square root of 9 and get 3, and then I'd have 2 things that would turn up because of that. Okay, so hopefully it's not turning into something that you're memorizing this formula, you're memorizing if it's greater than 0, that means there's 2. You're kind of thinking about why would there be 2? Why would there be 1? Why would there be no real solution? Okay, all right, that is it for your lesson. Make sure you pay attention to if it says to solve, you are doing the whole thing. You are finding those answers. If it wants the discriminant, that's the only part you are doing. Okay, so pay attention to those directions and have fun on your homework.